in the middle of our pandemically depressed times, for a place like Hallwalls, we wonder what we do programmatically, because we exist to create programs like gallery exhibitions, concerts, readings, performances, all of which we want people to come to and to socialize at and to experience. So one of the things I decided to do at this time was to do some short viral studio visits with artists that Hallwalls has worked with over the years, see what they're up to at this moment, see how they're doing. And I couldn't think of a better place to begin than with Peter Daria and Andrea Mancuso, who since 1987 have worked under the pseudonym, the artist pseudonym virocode. So Peter and Andrea, hi.
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 How are you guys doing?
Fine.
Good. We are like at a little distance here because of my exposures, but that's why I'm chroma keying out at different times than her. So
that's a nice effect, though. It's good.
Yeah.
So let's get right down to it. Obviously, I wanted to start with you guys because you work under the name virocode, and if you could just briefly reflect back on how you came to that name and decided to use that name as your artist pseudonym.
Okay. Yeah. I think we just have to we
well,
have to go back in time.
yeah, there was a puff of smoke and then, whatever. But basically we were interested in working together and working as an entity that didn't have so much of an identity that was a personal identity or a cultural identity, more of a group that would maybe incorporate others and also not be identifiable as one particular viewpoint.
Yeah.
Really to kind of,
like ambiguous, a little ambiguous there. And but it was a long time ago, actually. And recently I was looking at that, trying to think about that time and work from that time. And 87 is the beginning of the internet, for us at least, and and using computers in our artwork, starting with using copiers, really, right? So, and fax machines. So it was kind of this moment of feeling connected technologically to people. So, and at the same time, of course, there also was the AIDS crisis that was just starting. So virocode, for us, I think, came from ultimately an optimistic point of view about what that kind of interconnectiveness could happen in terms of code and viruses, right? So, I
mean, the vernacular of it, do you want to go into that? Or, I mean,
yeah.
Viruses are basically, they're between living and non-living, and virocode work has always kind of been concept driven and always about ideas, sometimes more than appearance. And our notion was that, if you can, we've always been based in the sciences for inspiration and also for our work. So viruses are sort of non-living, sort of living. They're sort of biochemical, sort of just chemical. And they are a simple way of transmitting information throughout an organic species, organic land. And this is even more true with RNA viruses like coronavirus. So this is more directly based on the etymology of it is why virus, and code, because there's we were very into, and still are, obviously, the electronic landscape with this binary kind of switching and transmission of information. So we were hoping to get across the idea of where our ethos is with the name, and then not who we are, but what we're about.
Yeah, and also I was looking today and found this old journal from the late 80s with it's not going to be that visible. No. But yeah, with just a description of that. And I was just reflecting on that idea, right, of what it is. And in here also this notion of, rapid and hopefully beneficial beneficial evolution, right? So this notion that the name of virocode is indicative of the swing of everyday thinking into the realm of the hyperreal, which I thought was also interesting to use that word for a time that maybe was talking a little bit more about the internet in that framework.
Although hyperreal is probably a great term for our present moment today, because if anything, this feels more than real because it's impacted all of us so directly. I was also thinking about, I mean, we could dive into so many parts of your practice over the decades, but I was thinking of a more recent series called ReNatured, partly because the idea of us not being able to escape the implications of nature. And you quote Timothy Morton in that project as saying, "We are no longer able to think of history as exclusively human." And here we are at the mercy of a virus, as we always are, but never quite in this gargantuan, epic, all-consuming kind of way. And ReNatured was interesting to me because I'm someone that admires nature, but I fear it. I fear its ambivalence towards us, and I feel I fear its indifference towards us. And it really puts it into context when you're thinking of us in that broader template of organisms. We're a speck.
Yeah, I think you're kind of right on with your suspicions. I mean, we are coming at this, and really for a long time, this boundary between organic and inorganic and world and living is these are Anthropocene kind of notions, and we have really kind of loved this idea of a flat ontology of things that are on equal playing fields depending on what you value about the playing field. So ReNatured is kind of about this. A lot of our work is from way back in San Francisco days when we were doing stuff about what is pathology. It's pathology. Is it good or bad? Is it most of our work is about catastrophic events, and it's catastrophic personal with diseases, or catastrophic globally, or physics, or universally. And it is a matter of perspective, and if you have a flat ontology belief about this, which I mean Tim Morton and a lot of these Graham Harman and a lot of these triple O people do, it's been codified in that kind of literary and philosophical sense, but it's been started to be codified since the 20s with quantum physics. I mean, it's always been, let's go look deeper in, and they'll see, oh, is it a wave? Is it particle? Is it one-dimensional, two-dimensional? Is it living, non-living? Is it, these things are kind of our arbitrary models that we create, and therefore we are stuck in unless we try to work it out.
It's also pretty fascinating to think about this time in terms of what is happening environmentally, right? I mean, along with the news of all of this economic collapse that's happening, there's also there's no emissions. There's this, China's reporting not having as much, smog. I mean, it's a really complicated and interesting relationship, and this time that we're in, this weird seems like a good word, hyperreal, I like that also, seems to be a time that kind of is sort of amplifying some of the things that we were thinking about in that series, more from just like an ecological point of view, but now it seems like this interconnectedness of the human and the non-human seems to be even more exaggerated, right? Their relationship and what that could mean, and how quickly that can change, right? Like how quickly things can flatten out, I guess.
I should mention that the image behind me is a detail from the ReNatured project. I always like this image a lot. It's sort of succumbing to nature. and sort of giving in or being overcome. Now, just prior to ReNatured, you did a series of photographic and Instagram-based works called No Plan for the Future, which kind of collapsed political ideology and political catastrophe with desserts and cakes and ice creams that had melted and smashed or been sat on. And it was sort of a humorous series. It didn't seem to at first have these dark underlying themes, but it's so funny that was only maybe a couple of years ago. And now I'm wondering, well, did we have no plan for the future? Is that really, I mean, it seems like we didn't.
Yeah, I mean, I will just start by saying that series really came out of an emotional place of feeling like we had reached a pinnacle, like an opportunity, like we had a chance. It felt like we were at a turning point, and we made what I thought was a misstep, and ultimately disappointed, right? And also questioning, like, have I not been in the world in the way that has this world changed so dramatically in a week, essentially around the election, than the world that I thought I was in, or the world I thought I was heading towards. Like, so I felt like I felt really sort of connected to that, and it was a bit of a gut reaction to use the food in that way, and it wasn't something that was like particularly easy for us to resolve initially with the work, actually. So it's been interesting and kind of, again, weird and unsettling that work is kind of living in this moment, right, where it's just so beautiful and lovely and exciting, and yet so tragic, right? So
yeah, it's funny. It gut reaction. I'm not just laughing just by the gastronomic events of it, but I had a hard time coming around to that series, more so than Andrea, who actually started, I think, with the first spill of a Slurpee in a store, getting into this, because to me it wasn't as, and this is the usual thing with the conceptual work, is it wasn't as conceptual as I first read it. And that is probably the strength of it. Most people can react to it on a level, and then if they want to dive deeper into what we're writing about it and talking about it, then they can get it what they want out of it that way, hopefully. But I think that as many times, she has a good instinct about these things, and it just panned out to really to co-segregate with what was happening in the political cultural landscape. And these kind of references, just as the administration evolved, revealed themselves in their actions, in their perspectives, in their policies, and unfortunately matched well with a well-crafted dessert or a well-crafted meal that had just been wasted, and things that had a direction or a purpose or a use sort of torn apart by destructive elements. So we both had worked during, or at least been students during, the Reagan time. And then for me, that was a difficult time, but it also, I recognized it later to be a very creative time, not just for us, but for in the art world in general. So I kind of figured that this element of political change would produce a lot of energy for those who felt the need to just communicate other perspectives, and I think it's happened a lot in these last 3 or 4 years. So,
well, that's kind of an interesting point, that the notion that the extremity of a moment leads to a certain amount of creative output from the community of artists. And
that's a catastrophic element that we love, but we hate. Yes.
Well, and I was also thinking, other people have already observed this, that or noted on Facebook, made comments like, well, I'm an artist, so I'm already, spend most of my time in self-quarantine because I'm in the studio.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask at this time where you're at home and maybe you now have a little more studio time or time together to talk about ideas. Has this hyperreal moment that we're in generated some new tangents of work for you?
Well, I think that for me, it's been an opportunity to look back at older work and think about that work with a little distance. I was always, like, will honestly admit to being haunted for the majority of my artistic life by a comment Kathy Acker made to me in graduate school when she looked at the work that we were doing and said something to the extent of that, do you know what you have here, or something like that? Do you know what you're talking about, what you're working with here? And I think in her kind of difficult and yet ultimately inspiring way, I think she was really at that time really challenging us and me personally to look a little bit more closely at the sort of the cultural landscape of disease that was happening then, right? So this is early 90s. And I don't know if, we were talking about this just the other day. I don't know if the work then really did deal with that in a way that was complete. So I think so one of the things is looking at this older work and then also just trying to lean into the ideas a little bit more. Like, I think that some of that work that was happening then, it's really complicated to have perspective, right? When you're in that moment. And I'm definitely finding that now here in this moment too, but I am trying to look at some of that older work with a chance to kind of really have perspective on what that work was saying, how important that work was for that time, and what about this time could be articulated a little bit more, like quickly, right? Just to try to really be in this moment for what it is. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm
What
just
happened?
seeing how I keep dropping out
You do drop.
distractedly there.
It's
Personally,
okay.
for me, I kind of function in this functioning at a distance with people anyway. So my some of my daily habits are the same in that way. I don't really like to be more than 6 feet from less than 6 feet from somebody. But I do have still work clinically, so I am exposed to a lot of people, which is not the best thing. And people are, like you were mentioning with nature, people are nature, and people are always duplicitous in their threat level. So it's always something that's in my mind. It's always been the way I am. So I think it probably will continue to be for me, and I think maybe for a lot more people, to look at things differently after this, because I don't think there is going to be an after this. Mm-hmm. This is coronavirus. This is something we've all had before, and this is just a different variety of it. This will sort of be like the flu, where you're going to need to develop vaccines every year or 3 and protect yourself as best possible. So I don't think this is a new paradigm. It's just a newly realized paradigm.
What about the work?
Oh, the work.
Can you imagine?
The
Yeah,
work.
I want to know.
Well, I mean, the work we've been doing a little bit more molecular work for the last 2.5 years. We've been working on a project that's molecular, called Geoplastic. It's developing a food source that can dissolve plastic, and since we all eat so much plastic, it could be actually useful. It's also a conceptually driven work, because we think of pollution in a liminal scale. That's kind of our Anthropocene focus on it, but there's a molecular scale where we're all ingesting and polluting the world. And so Geoplastic is taking the organisms that produce yogurt and genetically transforming them to produce an enzyme called PETase that has been identified in 2016 in Sakai, Japan, in Ideonella sakiensis. And this is PETase is in lots of things. It's in waxworm moths, and it's in Ideonella, and it's in some other species as well. So these are now codified, genetically codified, and we're transforming the organism Strep thermophilus, which is part of the Lactobacillus, which is our yogurt-producing bacteria, to make a yogurt that you eat like you would yogurt, but it also can dissolve the plastics that we ingest and breathe and live in.
Yeah, that project also, because we've been working at Coalesce and in the lab, which for me, I didn't have that much experience working in the lab. Peter has, but it's been really interesting in thinking about, a lot of the language that's in our world right now, things like PCRs and vectors and thermocyclers, like just the lab work, or just that experience in the last year of working right with primers and other things that you can't see. You get these vials from the lab that are empty. They look empty, but they're not empty, right? And how do you work with a material that you can't have a direct relationship with, right? That is always mediated through some kind of tool. So that idea of that data, like as that data represents what that thing is, has been another kind of interesting problem we've been struggling with, like how to represent that and how to transform that. I mean, right, like you transform that genetically, but then how do you transform that into some kind of art experience, artwork?
I want to take a left turn for my last question and and ask Andrea, because I know you have been recently playing a video game called Death Stranding, which is the latest work from master video game auteur Hideo Kojima. And I think it's kind of interesting that you're playing that game because, as I understand it, in that game, you play as a courier in a post-apocalyptic world. You're delivering packages between communities and also trying to reestablish links and connections between communities. So it sort of thematically has this undercurrent of connection and bringing people together. And some of the mechanics in that game, ladders and ropes and things, are kind of underscore that. So do you want to say anything about your experience with that game?
I will. I mean, I'll have to say that in part, as we were heading into this period, I thought we should invest in a PlayStation or a video console. This is a PlayStation, right? So, and had thought about doing that a little while ago, but then never did. But then learned about this particular game, which seemed to open up a world that you could occupy and had a really interesting aesthetic to it, right? And physicality and depth to the story. So I was intrigued, and yes, have jumped into some video game playing experience. I was surprised by a lot of parts of that game, right? Like I love the ladders and the rappelling. And the other day I got stuck on a cliff edge, which is, I think, maybe like clipping or like an error in the game, but it was really interesting because I had made it up, I'm bringing my packages and I have fallen a couple times. So every time you fall, your packages get damaged. So you can't fall too many times. But fortunately, if you fall and you die, you can't die because this character can go through the sort of painful rebirth, but can come back. So it's good and bad. It's good because, well, that's nice, you can keep playing. It's bad because you end up in the same predicament that you were in before. So you have to make it through that moment. I mean, in fact, I didn't realize you could actually go back to another period in the game, but I thought I was stuck there. So I spent like 2 days trying to figure out what to do about this cliff edge. I climbed up the ladder and I'm at the edge of the cliff. And it looks like my character should be able just to jump over the rocks just at the top of the cliff, just to make it to the edge, onto the plateau. And it wasn't able to. So then I tried to use a bunch of other tools to get past that point. And I couldn't get past that point until I learned that I had to go all the way back. Anyway, I think it's, that's sort of a long-winded.
Well, she's interested in clipping too. We did a video about clipping events in
We're
Grand
clipping
Theft
right
Auto.
now.
I know.
We're clipping all the time.
I'm trying not to clip, but anyway.
Yeah, I know that it's really popular. A lot of people are interested in games, and I wanted to, and I've always loved them. I remember many hours invested in playing Myst and other games as they've come through, and this one's great. It's really an interesting departure. I enjoy actually watching someone else play as well.
Are you a gamer, John?
John's a gamer.
I was playing some Fallout 3 before I called you today.
Gamer's got a game.
Wait, do you like? I like watching someone else play.
Well, YouTube is full of great gameplay videos. So depending on the game and depending on the gamer, it can be very compelling to watch.
Yeah. This game is really beautiful. I have to say, I didn't really. I haven't played a game in a long time, so I've been sort of blown away by just the sort of the immersive experience with just a little hand controller, right? It's really
As
really
close
lovely.
to travel as you can get right now, I think.
It is. And,
That's true, yes.
so thank you very much at this tough moment, taking some time to talk today. It's really nice. Hate the social distance that we're at. I love seeing you both, and I hope to see you again real soon in person. So
Yeah.
thank you again.
Thank
Stay
you.
well in this infodemic.
Yes. Thanks.